Welcome, everyone. This is Leslie Freeman with the Center for Integral Wisdom, welcoming you to today's Thought Leader Dialogue as part of our Thought Leader Dialogue series. This weekend, we're delighted to welcome Richard Barrett, Zach Stein, and Marc Gafni for a dialogue on the metrics of human consciousness. They'll be exploring the new thought emerging in Richard's new paper by the same name called The Metrics of Human Consciousness. And because during this dialogue, Richard will be referring to some tables in the paper, which we'd love you to be able to see in real time, I've sent out the link to that PDF in your reminder emails, which you've gotten 2 of in the last day. So if you're interested to have the paper open, go ahead and find that link, and I'll also paste it into the participant dashboard. So I'd like to start by introducing our guests. The first one is Richard Barrett. He is the founder and chairman of the Barrett Values Center and an internationally recognized thought leader on values, culture, leadership, and consciousness. An author, speaker, and social commentator on the evolution of human values in business and society, he's also a fellow of the RSA, a United Kingdom-based enlightenment organization. He's the fellow of the World Business Academy, a fellow, member of the Wisdom Council of the Center for Integral Wisdom, honorary board member of the Spirit of Humanity Forum, and former values coordinator at the World Bank. He is the creator of the internationally recognized Cultural Transformation Tools, CTT, which have been used to support more than 5,000 organizations in 60 different countries on their transformational journeys. More can be found at Richard's site, valuescenter, with an RTRE.com. Zach Stein's work focuses on social justice and education through the lenses of developmental psychology and integral meta-theories. He holds degrees in philosophy and religion from Hampshire College and educational neuroscience, human development, and the philosophy of education from Harvard University. He was a co-founder of Lectica, Inc., a nonprofit dedicated to the research-based, justice-oriented form of large-scale standardized testing in K-12 higher education and business. He has published in a wide range of outlets, including American Psychologist, New Ideas in Psychology, Mind, Brain, and Education, Integral Review, and the Journal of Philosophy of Education. He is currently the academic director of the activist think tank at the Center for Integral Wisdom and core faculty at Meridian University. And Dr. Marc Gafni is a visionary thinker, social activist, philosopher, wisdom teacher, and author of 10 books, including the award-winning Your Unique Self, The Radical Path to Personal Enlightenment, and most recently, Tears, Reclaiming Ritual, Integral Religion, and Rosh Hashanah, which is out this month. He holds his doctorate in philosophy from Oxford University, rabbinic certification from the Chief Rabbinate in Israel, as well as private rabbinic ordination. Dr. Gafni is the co-initiator with leading integral philosopher Ken Wilber of the Center for Integral Wisdom, an activist think tank dedicated to evolving and articulating a shared global framework of ethics, eros, and meaning. And in partnership with leading thinkers and change agents working on key social issues, Gafni's work in the world is focused on collectively reshaping key pivoting points in consciousness and culture. More can be found about Dr. Gafni and his work and the Center for Integral Wisdom at ievolve.org. And with that, I welcome our guests, and welcome. You all have a mic.
Thank you. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you very, very much. And, thank you, everyone, for being with us. And, introductions actually matter, and not so much in terms of the accolades, but in terms of kind of framing the context for the conversation. And in this conversation, right, we're meeting in the context of the Center for Integral Wisdom, which is a think tank on the future of values and meaning. And we're delighted to have Richard on our Wisdom Council. Zach is the academic director of the center. Ken Wilber has been in this conversation with us. Richard, Ken and I did a dialogue early on, and Zach, Ken and I have been in many, many, many conversations over the years. And, where this kind of began was, and let me kind of set the context. Richard and I met actually at an excellent think tank retreat, both invited by our mutual friend John Mackey, who is also actually the chair of the Center for Integral Wisdom, on the topic of conscious capitalism. And I have to say, if I can introduce a personal dimension, I was just delighted to meet Richard, independent of any, thought constructs. We just had a delightful time kind of talking about life in Yorkshire, where Richard ostensibly hails from, and learning about the work of the Barrett Value Center, which is just the incredibly exciting work that Richard's done over the years, deploying different forms of kind of creative metrics, almost pedagogical metrics, and I'll explain what I mean in a second, right, throughout the corporate, organizational, and governmental world. And at some point, our two, loves met. I asked Richard, let's talk about unique self. And for those of you who haven't been in a previous conversation, unique self is a structured stage of consciousness that actually is always present, but when you actually evolve to higher levels of consciousness, it becomes kind of the major center of gravity, right, in the human being. It becomes the guiding force, both in the creation of community. Unique self is the technology for creating a larger evolutionary we space, a unique we, right? And it's the highest level of kind of human emergence. So it's a formal structure stage of emergence, right, as well as the nature of reality up and down. Unique self is always present, but becomes available, it comes online at the higher levels of consciousness, and it's a central, what we might call, in integral terms, we like to use the word psychoactive. It's a psychoactive idea. And once you get unique self, it tells you a lot about identity, which is the key linchpin, right, in the evolution of consciousness. And then, more and more social scientists are realizing at this moment that actually, in order to address the real social issues, primary issues of social justice, right, and issues of meaning, right, that face us, right, we need to actually go to the root issues of identity. We're past the age of social engineering, where kind of Band-Aids can be put on. There's a real understanding, right, in the literature today that there's an enormous need to actually go back to root identity. Charles Taylor, of course, already understood this in his epic work, The Sources of Self. And so Zach and I, at the think tank, have been doing a lot of thinking about development and unique self and actually planning a major work, right, in that direction. Richard, right, and I started talking about, well, what would it mean to create a metrics of unique self? What would that mean? And Zach and I started a parallel conversation, and then Ken joined the conversation, and then Richard and I kind of went to town on it because Zach was at that time finishing his doctorate at Harvard. So Richard and I kind of went to town, like, what would that mean to create a metrics of unique self? How would we measure unique self? And the three of us kind of joined in the conversation, and Richard essentially suggested that the best first step would be, before we approach a metrics of unique self, let's talk about just a metrics of consciousness in general. Let's have a kind of prior conversation, a meta conversation, and then move towards the metrics of unique self. So let me just say one more word and then actually pass it to Zach, who will create some framing comments. And then Richard, who's the star of our show today, is going to take us into a beautiful 60-page work that he wrote for the world, but also, as a think tank, we want to really appreciate that. So I really asked him to kind of put this in paper, and he just blew it away, out of the park, with this beautiful little gem of a book, on the metrics of consciousness, which we'll be releasing, relatively soon. Let me just give a couple more framing remarks, not just, broadly, but very specifically about the topic at hand. So let's talk about unique self. Let's put unique self aside for a second. We'll come back to it and just talk about unique self as an expression of consciousness. Right? It's an interior expression. Consciousness is an interior correlate. It's not merely an epiphenomena. They were looking at it. It's not really an epiphenomena. It's not really a result of the brain, but consciousness has its own ontology. Right? It's a guiding, right, initiating, eros of reality. Right? So generally, consciousness is understood to be subjective. It's a subject. Right? In our kind of scientifically colonized world, meaning where the dogmas of scientism kind of colonized our mind space in so many ways, right? The very notion of talking about a metrics, measurement of consciousness is a non-starter. What do you mean? You can measure objective exterior correlates, right, that are accessible, right, through the eye of the senses, through sensory empirical verification, or the eye of the mind, right, mathematical deductive constructs, right? That's measurable, right? But by its very nature, we say that interiors are not measurable. Consciousness, which is an interior, unique self, which is an expression of that interior, is not measurable. So the entire conversation is suspect to the popular mind from the beginning. And not only is it suspect, it's even thought to be perhaps dangerous. and not entirely for wrong reasons. Right? The second you try and measure consciousness, you're trying to control it. Right? How do you use that data? How do you arrive at that data? Right? Are you using it to create a kind of ranked dominator hierarchy between higher and lower consciousness? But there's enormous suspicion, right, of measurement, right, in consciousness. A, how does it work? But B, isn't it dangerous? And so I really want to surface those two issues because they exist very, very deeply. And whenever I've talked to people about the work that Ken, Zach, Richard and I are doing, immediately kind of your kind of classical, contemporary, modern, or even postmodern, even more thinker almost bristles at the idea, that A, that you could measure consciousness at all, and B, that wouldn't be a kind of a dangerous Orwellian proposition. And of course, all of us on the phone, at the think tank and at the Barrett Values Center, right, believe that actually creating a metrics of consciousness is absolutely essential, right? And so let's try and put forth kind of some of our thinking about measurement. I'm going to turn to Zach, and then, again, we're going to get to the star of our show today, to Richard, to really take us through, right, his vision of the metrics of consciousness. Zach, welcome.
Yes, thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure, again, to be on the phone with you, Mark, and to talk to you actually for the first time here, Richard, outside of email. I'm going to pick up pretty much directly on what Mark raised here. And the word Orwellian, I think, is appropriate when you think about psychological measurement. And of course, this was the focus of my doctoral work, was social justice and standardized assessments of the mind, right? And if you look at the history of this field, it's actually been riddled with the abuse of standardized testing. So, right, we go back to France when the IQ test was invented by Binet. The interesting kind of historical irony here is that Binet created the IQ test, but he did not believe that there was such a thing as innate intelligence. And Binet did not believe that the IQ test got at anything like what many people think it does get at. He invented it solely for a compassionate purpose, which was to identify those individuals, those children with learning disabilities, basically. So at the very birth of this movement of measuring minds, if you will, there was a sense that we need to be responsible here and we need to use these compassionately. Now, but many of us know the history of IQ testing, which was taken from France and brought into the UK and brought into America and wedded to the eugenics movement. And it became basically an instrument of domination. And it's, for example, in America, it was used to justify the sterilization of tens of thousands of people because they were determined by an IQ test, which was racially, ethically, linguistically biased, but nevertheless they did poorly, and they were sterilized. And the Nazis picked directly up on that. And so, fast forward, many of the eugenics, kind of accoutrements to the IQ testing movement have been jettisoned, but the IQ test remains. And because of its power as a metric, right, which is to say because it's been institutionalized as a part of various both educational and kind of psychological research aspects, the idea that there is some inherent, innate, changeless intelligence that everyone has become taken for granted in our culture. When in fact, there is no such thing as IQ, right? There is no such thing as IQ. But because of the way the measure has been institutionalized, as I said, especially as a part of psychological research, it's as if we have no other way to think. And so it's very important that we transform the very nature of psychological assessment. And there's a couple more things I'll say and then I'll turn it over. One reason is that we live in a knowledge economy. And we actually live in a situation where consciousness itself has kind of become the raw material on which we must work to make a better world. So it's not the case that we need, in many parts of the world, it still is the case that we need better infrastructure and we need basic goods for survival. But for many of us, that's not what's going on. What's going on is the need for self-transformation. And since the 1970s at least, there's been a huge movement in economics focusing on human capital metrics, which is to say not the measurement of kind of buildings and technology and money, but the measurement of skills and capacities in individuals. And actually those are the essential components of the future economy. And so we are still dominated by simplistic ways of thinking about measuring minds. And what Richard's done and what other folks associated with the developmental psychology, which started with Maslow and Kohlberg and Piaget. What other folks have done there is actually to bring forward a very new approach to thinking about measurement in the first place, where what you're measuring is not a fixed static trait like IQ, but what you're measuring is something that evolves and changes over the life course, where people become qualitatively new in their thinking and their personality and their emotional self-regulation, etc. And so, Richard's paper is an important step towards getting some new basic infrastructures. It's like we figured out how to measure the geosphere and the physical world. Now we need measures for the noosphere. And we short-circuited that conversation with the IQ testing movement, with the Scholastic Aptitude Test, and the other things that go on with standardized assessment and education around the world. So I really just applaud the broadening of this conversation to include the work of Richard, which pulls directly from the work of Abraham Maslow, which gets at a construct that is profoundly different from the IQ and profoundly important, even from a social justice perspective, to get that way of thinking about the nature of our minds into the culture and to have it institutionalized in terms of a metric. So that's. I think I'll leave it there and give it to Richard.
Fantastic. Thanks, Zach.
Well, thanks so much, Zach, and thank you also, Mark, and thanks to you, Leslie, for introducing us and bringing us together today. So it's difficult to know where to begin on such a complex topic, but let me just say, when I met Marc in 2012 in Esselen, it was as if he challenged my soul to come up with a metric for consciousness. Well, that wasn't so much of a challenge as I thought, because actually the work that I did in 1996 and 97 led to the creation of a model of consciousness and a way of measuring consciousness by mapping values, which has been used now for over 16 years to map the values of 5,000 or 6,000 organizations and over 4,000 leaders. So we've been doing this for a long period of time, and we've learned an awful lot about measuring consciousness. But the challenge that Marc gave to me, unbeknownst to him, was to dig deep into the first principles of consciousness to justify what we've been doing. It was like intuitively came up with this model. But as over the period from the start of the use of the model until today, the model has been continually teaching me. So what is it that we're actually measuring? Well, this is one of the topics that I begin writing about in the paper. What is consciousness, and how did it evolve, or how does it evolve? And for this, I went back to first principles. In fact, I went back to the Big Bang. And I said, look, evolution has been going on for 13 billion years, and here on the planet Earth for about 4 billion years. And so how has consciousness evolved? Because the interior, let's say the exterior of the entities that inhabit our planet must have evolved at the same time as the interior. In other words, the mind evolved at the same time as the physical form of our evolutionary ancestors. And so this led me to inquire as to how consciousness has evolved. And from that, I began to develop the idea of 3 universal stages of consciousness. And you see these in the different planes of being, as the evolution of the atomic plane, from atoms to molecules to cells, and then the evolution of the cellular plane, from individual cells to organisms to larger organisms. And then in the plane of creatures, we see the evolution of consciousness to the pinnacle that we've reached now, which is Homo sapiens. And I can see the consciousness of Homo sapiens evolving over the past 200,000 or 300,000 years. And my inquiry led me to what was it about that evolution that was common to each plane of being? What happened in the evolution of the atomic plane to get to the cellular plane? What happened in the cellular plane to get to the plane of creatures? And what's now happening with Homo sapiens? And I found these universal principles of evolution. The first thing is that an entity, no matter what plane of being it is at, must become viable and independent in its framework of existence. Otherwise, it will not survive in our physical world. And then as the framework conditions become more complex and challenging, what do individual entities do? They bond with other individual entities to create a group structure. And then as framework conditions become more complex, those group structures learn how to cooperate with each other to create the next higher order entity. And that's how atoms evolved into molecules, evolved into cells, evolved into organisms, evolved into creatures. And that's how one creature, Homo sapiens, is moving forward. And those three stages of development at each plane of being had something in common. That is, there was one entity at the plane of being of atoms and the one entity at the plane of being of cells, and there was one entity at the plane of being of creatures, which led the evolutionary process. At the atomic level, it was the carbon atom. At the cellular level, it was the eukaryotic cell. And at the plane of creatures, it's Homo sapiens. So what is it that these three entities have in common? Well, it's simple. What they have in common is the ability to bond and cooperate. The carbon atom bonds more than any other atom. The eukaryotic cell was different from its predecessor, the prokaryotic cell, because the organelles of the prokaryotic cell were in the cell membrane, but in the eukaryotic cell, those organelles moved to the center and left the surface of the cell available for communication. And what we see with Homo sapiens is it is the creature amongst all others which has the greatest ability to bond and cooperate. And so at each stage, at each plane of being, what you see is an expansion in the sense of identity. And that is happening in Homo sapiens. So now let's just deal with Homo sapiens and what originally I called the 7 levels of consciousness model, but then came to realize in recent years that actually it's the 7 stages of psychological development also. So human beings go through 7 stages of psychological development, and each stage we begin to adopt a larger and larger sense of identity, and whatever we identify with, we care for. And each stage has specific needs that must be fulfilled. And whatever it is that we need is what we value. And so our values are linked to our needs, and our values reflect the stage of psychological development we're operating at and the levels of consciousness we're operating from. And so if you can ask somebody, what are your values? You can place them in these different levels of consciousness, and you can map the consciousness of an individual, an organization, or a nation, or any group structure. And that is the basis of the measuring system. By mapping values, we measure consciousness. And that is what we've been doing now for, as I said, 16 or 17 years. So what is this developmental model that I have put forward for measuring consciousness, or mapping the stages of psychological development? Well, the first stage is surviving. It's the stage from 0 to 2 where we learn to physically survive in our physical, three-dimensional physical world. And then as we develop our language skills, we move into the conforming stage, usually from 2 to 8 and onwards, but mainly from 2 to 8 years old, where we realize that in order to feel safe we need to conform to the parental and cultural framework in which we exist. And then we move to the differentiation stage, which goes on until our 30s, where we learn to develop ourselves in a way that we can be recognized by others, by our peers, so that we can differentiate ourselves from others, but within the cultural framework of our existence. And during these first three stages, these are the stages that Maslow referred to as satisfying our deficiency needs. We are dependent. We live in a dependent world. We're living in a cultural framework which we were born into. And at the next stage is the individuation stage, which Carl Jung talked about very much in his works. We begin to separate ourselves from this cultural background to find out who we are. This is the first stage, I believe, of living the soul self. And as we then separate ourselves from our background by identifying the values that we align with and the beliefs that we align with, which are different from our cultural background, we become individuated. And at this stage, we also need to let go of the subconscious beliefs that we learned during those first three stages of our development about meeting our unmet needs or satisfying our unmet needs. If we've got unmet needs which we didn't learn to master because of the difficult situation in which we live, the parental programming and cultural conditioning, we may have these fear-based beliefs keep us anchored in these first three levels of consciousness. However, as we individuate, to become more fully who we are, we embrace, we let go of the false self that Marc talks about, and we begin to open ourselves up. In our 40s, we individuate. In our 30s, in our 40s, we begin to open ourselves up to self-actualization. The unleashing or the uncovering of the unique self, the gifts and talents that bring passion to our lives, the things that we were born to do. And during the 40s, we move through that self-actualization stage, and then in our 50s, we enter the integrating stage, which is we begin now to align with other people who share the same universal soul values, but also those who share our sense of vision and mission, so that we can make a bigger difference in the world than we could on our own. And as we pass through the 50s and reach the 60s, we enter into the serving stage, where now our sense of identity is so large that it embraces the whole of humanity, and all we want to do at that stage is to be the servant of humanity. I put it a different way in one of my books called What My Soul Told Me. I talk about becoming fully the servant of your soul, letting your unique self be fully activated in the world around you. Now, just to conclude for the moment, let me just say, as I've said, each stage of psychological development has specific needs that you must satisfy, and each set of needs is linked to a set of values. And so if you can understand what your values are, or the values of the organization or nation which you're living in are, then you can measure the consciousness of yourself, of the organization, or of the nation. Now, if you haven't already done so, at the end of the program, I suggest you try this out for yourself by simply going to www.valuescenter.com/PVA, Personal Values Assessment. In 5 minutes, you can do the assessment, and within 2 minutes or 3 minutes, you'll get the result, a assessment of your own personal values. So let me stop there. I've tried to cover an awful lot in a very short space of time, but I really would like to now hear from Marc and Zach about their thoughts on what I've been talking about.
Yeah, Zach, why don't you take it away, brother? I'll follow you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, beautiful. First of all, just beautiful. I think one direction I'd like to head in is, when I use this phrase consciousness, or the term rather, typically I make a distinction between sentience and sapience, right? Because often when people say, well, you can't measure consciousness, what they're talking about is a quality of awareness that is actually ubiquitous in the universe, right? And as you were describing, through the course of terrestrial evolution, there's been this kind of co-evolution of the kind of material form and the consciousness that's embodied in it. However, at a certain point, an extremely unique form of consciousness emerged, which I'd call sapience. And what I would say particularly unique about it is language. And this gets to the heart of some of the real complexities in the measurement of consciousness, because the way we experience consciousness is extremely linguistically, it's saturated with language, right? The very texture. So it's it's not that we're trapped in language. We can kind of stick our nose through the bar and kind of smell reality. But at the same time, language suffuses our experience, and the only way to get at consciousness to measure it is to use language as an intermediary. And one of the deep complexities that I've faced in my own work around measurement is this problem of language, right? So when you say that it's our values, that determine our level of consciousness, entirely agree. But the only way to get at someone's values is to see which kind of words they use and which kind of words they gravitate to. And the problem that I've had with some of the developmental work that gets done is that too often people, when they're facing these assessments, because they know it's a hierarchy and because they want to feel good about themselves, or maybe it's in a work context and they're afraid for their jobs, or I'm sure it's not, you got to use these things right to make that not probable. But at the same time, there's a tendency to talk the talk of the higher level, when in fact the structural transformations that you're describing have not taken place yet. And this is a big problem in measurement. And so, the approach that we've taken is to provide individuals a place to do constructed response, right? And so in assessment, there's this distinction between constructed response and selected response. And selected response, we all know, it's multiple choice, or it's selecting words from a list of words. But constructed response is when you answer an open-ended question and actually speak or write in an open-ended manner. And we've preferred this because it allows us to get into the structure of the thought and the structure of the values that are held, as opposed to just the language that's used. And so I'm curious, because I've looked at your instruments, kind of how have you dealt with this problem of language? And, I guess I'll stop there and see how that landed with you.
Sure, that's a really important point. There are several answers to that. First of all, every template of values we use in every assessment, that's a list of 80 to 90 words, is actually customized for that organization or that group of individuals. So it reflects the language that they use. And we use very simple terms. And so in this manner, we've not had a real problem in mapping, for people understanding the words that they're using, because we test the template with a number of people before we actually do the survey. So this customization is vitally important, and we do that in different ways, because we don't only have positive values, we have what we call potentially limiting values, such as in an organizational setting we'll have something like bureaucracy or blame or internal competition. And some people say, well, why are those values? Well, they're values because if people didn't value them, they would not behave in ways which display these values. But these values are what we call limiting values because they are fear-based and they are the responses of the ego. And this is really useful because if we map, if we ask the question, which of the following values behaviors most represent how your organization operates, and people pick a group of 100 people, and we look at everybody picks 10, that's 1,000 votes. And if we look at the proportion of votes for these potentially limiting values, we measure something called cultural entropy. It's the degree of dysfunction in the organization. So if you've got a degree of function entropy around 10%, in other words, 10% of the votes for these limiting values, which occur during the first 3 levels of level consciousness, if it's about 10%, that's about prime. We find these companies are really highly functioning, whereas if you get up to 30 or 40%, then the entropy, we find these organizations are very poor performers. And in fact, we've correlated the level of cultural entropy with the level of employee engagement and find it to be a very, very tight link. And so high entropy leads to low engagement, and low entropy leads to high engagement, as you might expect. If there's a lot of dysfunction in the organization, then people will not be engaged. But what is really interesting is we're able to pull out from that data which precise values are contributing to the dysfunction of that group. And now we can also do the same thing on an individual by asking a leader, what values do you operate with, picking from a customized list of 80 or 90 words, but then asking 15 people who work with that leader to pick 10 values about how that leader operates. And again, the list of words includes positive as well as potentially limiting values. And so we can actually measure the personal entropy of the leader. We can see which levels of consciousness this leader is operating at by the distribution of the values that the respondents are picking about the leader. And so, and this, what we have found is that this also links very closely with Keegan's 3 types of mind: the socialized mind, the self-authoring mind, and the self-transforming mind. And that these higher levels, the upper 2 levels of consciousness, correlate with Keegan's self-transforming mind, and whereas the lower 3 levels of consciousness correlate with the socialized mind. So one more thing to say. When we decided to try to use the measuring instrument with children, okay, so now we're talking about people who do not have highly evolved language and probably might not know value words. What we did was we translated those value words into phrases that the children could understand and used their language, and then related those little phrases to value, and then related that value then to a level of consciousness. So we've been actually able to do this with children as young as 8 and 10 years old. I say this has been successful because, you know, when you feed back the results back, people say, yeah, that's it, that's who we are, and that rings true. So let me stop there and just say that's how we've handled the language question so far to date. It has not really been a problem at all.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. I'll pull out there the diagnostic moment in all of this, right? And this is what I was talking about with Benet at the birth of the IQ testing movement. The whole point was to be able to make a kind of compassionate, kind of justice-oriented intervention through objective measurement, right? And that's, I think, what people who are skeptical that we should or can measure consciousness miss, is that actually with a good measurement tool, you can make you can have incredible diagnostic impact, which is, as you just described, we can know exactly which are the values that are bogging you down and make moves on those. And so I just wanted to offer that. I mean, often the comparison's made to good diagnostic instruments in medicine, which of course tremendous amount of money is thrown at figuring out how to make good diagnostic tools that measure things accurately and pinpoint exactly what the issue is. And to do that in the life of the mind, as you're doing, that's where some of the real value added comes from, metrics of human consciousness, So I wanted to pull that out.
Let me just pick up on that and say one more thing. When we map the values of a whole organization, people go online and they pick out which department, which business unit, what level, etc., what gender, etc. So we can actually pull out the results for the top 15 people, the top 50 people. And what we find is so fascinating. Because it's these people at the top that set the culture. The culture of an organization is a reflection of leadership consciousness, but it's also represents a legacy of past leaders as the values of past leaders have been institutionalized in the systems, policies, and procedures. So when you do an organizational transformation, you have to work not only with the existing leaders, but you have to rethink the policies, systems, and procedures to shift the underlying values. But now let's just talk about the leadership team. And here, it is quite remarkable because when you map the values of the leadership team, their personal values, you'll see them showing up at levels 4, 5, and maybe even 6. When you ask them what values do you see in your organization, they will be much lower. And there may be high entropy, or there may not be any entropy, so there will be entropy, but it may be low. But it's generally speaking, in consciousness terms, lower levels of consciousness. And then when you ask them to pick out the values that represent a high-performance organization, the distribution of those values is almost a mirror reflection of their own personal values, even though the words are not the same. And so when you feed the results back, you say, well, look, this is who you say you are on the left. Here in the center is what you've created. It's much lower. And this is what you want over here, the desired, which looks a lot like who you are. So why did you create this when you want that and this is who you are? This is an amazing moment of cognitive dissonance in the leadership team or in any team when they realize that they have created a culture which is lower levels of consciousness than they actually think they're operating at and what they want. And that, to me, right there, you've got the full utility of the instrument because it creates a situation where people now have to reflect. Because the data is not from some external source. It is their data. They put it in there. All we did was pull it all together and show it in a format which speaks to or gives us the insights necessary to understand what is happening.
And that makes sense. Please go, Jack. You go ahead. You go ahead, brother. I'll jump in after you. Go ahead.
I was just going to, just reiterate that that's the power of the objectivity of an instrument, as opposed to having a consultant come in and hang out and give great advice, and it may be great, but it's easy to dismiss, and you can avoid it and rationalize away from it. But when you've got this objective thing staring in the face, it's like a mirror often when the assessment is good. And so just again, the importance of moving towards these kinds of rigorous objective measures is, it's hard to deny when you hear these kinds of accounts. Yeah,
no, totally.
Marc,
totally.
I'm going to jump in, but let me just say one more really important thing, 2 sentences.
Please, brother.
The value of this instrument is coming back year after year and measuring, not benchmarking against other organizations, but benchmarking against yourself by saying, how did consciousness shift from now to between last year and now?
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. It's and I'm completely enjoying the conversation. And let me jump in on 3 fronts here, right? And again, the most important part of this conversation is kind of the broad parameters that we can kind of create a shared space in, right? That is to say that metrics is essential. Zach, you really devoted your life to kind of work with Kurt Fisher and metrics, and we've talked a lot about metrics. It's going to be an essential part of the think tank. Richard, after you've left the World Bank and started the Barrett Value Center, you have a very, very unique, body of empirical knowledge of really kind of enacting, these constructed metrics, right, in many, many, many contexts. And even though they're not exactly double-blind contexts, right, there's an enormous amount of just empirical validation, which is hugely valuable. And I think there's a couple of things that, and as we're kind of constructing a model, in-house that we're kind of looking at that I want to share with you, Richard, and Zach, you're deeply familiar, and please comment, where there's a couple issues we need to look at, right? One is, in other words, although you went back and forth on this issue, Zach, you and Richard, right? But we didn't fully exhaust, right, the issue that you raised, Zach, right? Which is, as long, the question is, how do we actually develop an instrument, right, which goes the next step? So as long as we're engaged in multiple choice, right, there's still a limitation in the system. And there's two limitations. One is the multiple choice limitation, which is the ability to actually respond at a different level of consciousness than you are, but you can speak the game even if you're not at that level of consciousness. And that's a gap that's actually an important gap. I've often talked to our buddy Ken about people who kind of, for example, speak integral, and they can actually speak the language really, really well, right, and actually aren't living integral. They haven't embodied it or internalized it, and actually is not what drives them. So kind of that gap is an important gap to look at and to see how we can overcome it. And Zach, if I understood you correctly, and please correct me if I didn't, right, what you said is partially addressed by Richard's response, but not fully, right? That is to say, right, Richard, what you're doing is you're customizing, which is I think the word you used, which is critical. You're customizing these, and the customization, there's an advantage and a disadvantage, right? The advantage is it's customized, right? It's unique selfized for the unique self of the corporation, right? The disadvantage is it's a very subjective call about, what values you attribute to what level. And that, when I went over it, that was actually, to me, the most interesting question, right? It's how do you actually decide that this value, right, is attributed to this level when this value itself has many, many different shades of meaning, and I could reasonably attribute that value in a different way to a lower or higher level. So there's a subjectivity in the process, which is not bad, but needs to be taken into account. And then that subjectivity is doubled, right, when the fact that you're actually making customized instruments. So that's both helpful, right, on the one hand. On the other hand, it introduces another level of subjectivity. That's kind of one. And again, none of these are kind of in any way critiques. We're just kind of in the conversation together as we move towards an emergent unique self-instrument. I think these are things we need to kind of take into account, right? And two is...
Can I just jump in just to say one word on that one, Mark?
Please, brother.
That is absolutely a consideration that we've noticed. So not only do we customize the actual words, we actually customize whether they're a positive word or a potentially limiting word, and also customize which level they care at for that particular client. So that in some way responds to your question there. Of course, when we're dealing with North America or USA, we only need to do that once or twice, and we captured that for the USA. But let me give you an example. When we use these tools in South America, in Spanish, the word image, which we usually customize as a potentially limiting value, you pay more attention to how you look than the substance. In South America, that's totally regarded as a positive value. So we customize it as a positive value.
Right. No, the customization, I totally get, how important that is, and that's a really big deal, and that definitely does address, right, a part of the concern. It's one of the many kind of key strengths of the system. So for sure, and totally received. Right. Let me jump into kind of the next issue, and again, this is kind of just part of the conversation, right, as we evolve towards unique self metrics. And that is kind of a distinction that we like to make between kind of structure stages and states, right? So, for example, in Annex 1, right, of the paper, you kind of talk about, what are the changes, Richard, that you made from the kind of core Maslow, 7 levels that you're kind of structured on, right, or emerging from, and you point out kind of how you kind of, how Maslow kind of died, which is really, really wild when you think about it. He died at 62. It's kind of like, wow, in 1970, kind of before the conscious movement really kind of takes root. So he's kind of speaking in terms of needs, right? And you kind of transpose that into consciousness, and particularly kind of drawing on kind of classical writings of, Vedic philosophy. So I think here it's just important to make a distinction, just to bear in mind. I think this came up when you, Ken, and I were talking as well, and it's worth putting on the table, which is a person can have an experience of, right, let's say, for example, world-centric consciousness, right, without ever having had a unitive experience, right? And so, for example, when we kind of overlay, let's say cosmic consciousness or unitive consciousness, right, on these structure stages of consciousness, I think we need to kind of look at that and have a conversation about that. Because a person can, kind of move up and feel the sense of, wow, I'm empathetic with all beings because cognitively, right, I think I should, right? And I kind of understand that, but I actually might not have, right, an actual experience, right, to match that. Right? I might not have actually a lived experience which has given me that. It might be a cognitive experience. Now, cognitive experiences are important, right, and shouldn't be in any way derided or devalued. That's an enormously important source of information. But I think we want to kind of ferret out because we actually want to encourage two kinds of knowledge. We want to encourage knowledge that comes through cognition, through my best, kind of take of reality, and we want to encourage knowledge which comes through actually a felt, unmediated, lived sense of spirit, right, that I get through spiritual experimentation, aka prayer, meditation, contemplation, which gives me, if you will, a direct satori. It's an unmediated experience of reality, right, vis-a-vis, right, an experience that comes from, right, a kind of cognitively constructed vision of reality. Now, we absolutely need both of them, 1,000%, but I'm not sure I would overlay, for example, cosmic consciousness, right, on level 7 or 6, right, because a person could actually reach level 7 or 6, right, and actually never even had an experience of cosmic consciousness. So, ferreting those two out is helpful because educationally it then encourages two forms of gnosis. It encourages what we would call, and I'm going to give you kind of some language that we're using for this, Richard, we're calling it waking up and growing up. Waking up would be, your classical wake-up technology, right, of, let's say, cosmic consciousness, right, in the Vedic traditions. You wake up to cosmic consciousness. Growing up would be to grow up through actual structure stages, levels of consciousness. And one of the things we're thinking about is the necessity to both wake up and grow up, right? And we want to be careful of conflating the two because they're actually two distinct strands, and a person can actually wake up to cosmic consciousness, right, and, right, be ethnocentric, paradoxically, right? So it's very possible that Osama bin Laden had a genuine experience of cosmic consciousness, but then interpreted through an ethnocentric prism, decided to take down the World Trade Center, right? And so the ability to ferret that out, and the person who actually really got this when he came over to America was actually Trungpa, right, at Naropa. And he used to say, Om Mani Padme Om, right, the classical wake-up, kind of Buddhist mantra, grow up. Om Mani Padme Om, grow up. That's actually what he would do. And his student, John Wellwood, in an early book, kind of pointed this out, right, and it kind of the nomenclature of wake up, grow up kind of, came into play, and then we added show up to it. Wake up, grow up, show up as your unique self. But if you put wake up, grow up, show up together, and you begin to map, Richard, your gorgeous, gorgeous system in wake up, grow up, show up, it might kind of, merging those two, show up as unique self, grow up, structure stages of consciousness, wake up, and in terms of kind of wake up technologies, right, that level of distinction might be an important prism. And just to, as Zach and I are kind of writing, we're kind of thinking into, that kind of nomenclature. So just kind of sharing that and kind of with delight in any kind of reflection. How does that land with you? Does that make sense? Does it not make sense? Is it mutually fructifying, or is it two different directions? Just kind of putting that in the space for our delight and for our, as we evolve the conversation. Again, to everyone listening, the purpose of this conversation is just to clarify. This is kind of like a delightful inside conversation. And our goal, again, is for all of us together, Richard, Marc, Zach, Ken, all of us together, to move, towards, a shared space, and we can actually articulate a unique self-metrics. Richard, ball in your court, sir.
Well, thank you indeed, sir. I'm in awe of the deepness of your thought. I wish I could get to that level of thinking myself.
He's making fun. He's making fun of me, everybody. But that's okay. Take it away, sir.
I wasn't actually. I was trying to be humble, but anyhow, okay. It wasn't about you. It was about me.
You see that? I misinterpreted it. Take it away, sir. I'm completely with you.
What I think we measure, I'm not sure that I'm 100% certain, but what I think we measure by using this tool is how people show up on what shows up. Because let's just take the leadership values assessment, where you as a leader get a chance to pick the values that you think that you operate with, and 15 people also get a chance to pick the values they think you operate with. But actually, what they're picking is how you show up, how you translate who you think you are into the external world. And very often we come across a situation where an individual, and I can show you many examples of this, where the individual shows themselves as, or thinks of themselves operating at levels 4, 5, and 6, even level 7 of consciousness, with absolutely no potential limiting values. And when you look at the top 10 values of the 15 people, you see that there isn't a single who evaluated them. There isn't a single value above level 4, and there are these limiting values such as demanding, bureaucratic, blaming, and so here is this person believing they operate like this, and when the reality is they're showing up like this. Now, when you give feedback to this sort of person, which I've done many times, we approach that by saying, well, look, you've got some wonderful qualities that you believe that you're expressing, but look how they're coming across. So what is it in you that is creating this situation which is does not correspond to how you see yourself? And so this is a moment, again, of cognitive dissonance, and a moment of reflection where the person begins to say, aha, their eyes open, and if they're willing to transform, and they say, well, I need help with this. And in some cases, they need psychotherapeutic help. In most cases, some good coaching will help. So in answer to your question, I think what we're measuring is how people show up. We're not in terms of the reflection from other people and the reflection of the employees on the organization. But how the individual answers the question may indeed be a reflection of where they think they're operating from. In other words, what you said originally, they have this. They think they're operating in a sustainable manner. They think they're operating with integrity, but they're not in reality. So, and we know that about the invitation that I gave you to do the personal values assessment on our website. We know that you will pick values that you think you operate with, or values that you aspire to. And so that will not be a really true reflection of who you are unless you've already found a certain level of integrity or authenticity, and then it will be. So let me stop there.
Great. Yeah, no, great. Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. And I think there's so much more to talk about. We're kind of at the end of our hour. So Zach, let's just ask everyone for kind of a closing statement, a kind of future direction. And again, to everyone listening, our goal in this conversation is really to bring us together, right, in pursuit of a metrics of consciousness, right, and particularly unique self metrics, and to really value and honor, and ultimately to incorporate dimensions of some of the kind of, hugely pioneering work that Richard's done kind of and enacted, and applied and transformed, transformed many corporations, organizations. This actually worked in the field, and we're kind of bringing kind of the academic side of things with the kind of meta-philosophical side of things together with the kind of enacted side of things, which is what an activist think tank is supposed to do in order to create, the next step. So kind of big, exciting. Zach, give us kind of a closing vision.
Yeah, I mean, I have one, and I think there's a way in which the golden egg here is, or the unique self metric. It's going to be some combination of selected response and constructed response, because the way to get around the conundrum of, okay, this person selected those values, but what do they really think about those values, is to ask them and to have them actually write or speak about why they selected the values they selected, and what those values mean to them. I mean, one thing we found consistently in our research, which is based entirely on constructed response, is that different people use the same word in very different ways. So whenever we have selected response items, we always have a space for individuals to kind of, tell me why and tell me what you think. And what this does is it allows you to not only see what they think, but to get into the how of their thinking, which is to say beyond just what they say, we can see the way they structure their thought processes. And this provides a diagnostic information at the level of the individual and a much better accurate sense of structure stage and the kind of a degree to which they're able to actually hold these values as opposed to just kind of espouse them, let's say. Right? They can make sense of their world in terms of these values, make judgments and justifications in terms of the values. So my sense is that, for large-scale organizational work, it's just not feasible to do constructed response on a large scale. I mean, we're working on automation. But for individual diagnostic purposes, constructed response gives you a deeper window into the meaning-making system of the individual. So that would be my vision, would be some way to combine these two to provide the kind of 360-style large-scale organizational approach that Richard brings with a more almost clinical diagnostic level of insight that comes from a measure like Keegan's or Kohlberg's where there is a constructed response element. And that's a very intriguing possibility, and there's nothing really like that out there. So that would be my vision.
Yeah. No, fantastic. Zach, thank you so much. Richard, give us a closing vision, sir.
Well, first of all, let me say, where did the last hour go? Did
I know.
you guys compress time, or what happened? Anyhow, let me just say, I think it would be, in moving forward, I think it would be good to pay attention, or some attention, to the book, my last book, The Evolutionary Coaching, where I set out the stages of psychological development. And what I have found is that they do strongly correlate to age ranges, and that it is very difficult to accelerate this process. There are individuals who will be operating at a level of psychological development or a level of consciousness beyond the age range that we would normally find that. But it is I think a very strong guide. There's some strong guiding principles there that you might want to look at as you move forward. And well, let me stop there. I find the conversation fascinating. I want to continue to reflect with you on how we can serve your needs, Marc, in finding a metric of unique self. I think there's a fundamental question there and that needs to be answered, and maybe you already have an answer to this, but it is why? Why would you like a metric of unique self? And if you did have a metric, in what way would it support an individual's personal evolution and emergence into unique unique self-consciousness? Because that actually, there's no point in having a metric unless it's going to be useful in some way to someone. And that's what happens with the cultural transformation tools. They're immensely useful to everybody in the organization, and to find out where they are, how they can move forward, etc. So the utility is vitally important.
Yeah. Zach, do you want to the last thought on that before I give my little conclusion, whatever that might be?
Oh, no, I would entirely agree with the utility question.
Yeah.
I mean, often we'll throw measures at things and they get in the way, and you need to have a good reason to deploy this work. And it also ties into just basic issues of construct and ecological validity in psychometrics, just you using this the way you intend to? Are you getting what you wanted from it? So that would be a foundational question before the design even, is to think, what would be the place where we use this, in what context? And it makes a big difference if you're doing whole organizations or if you're doing one-on-one coaching, what the age ranges are. So yeah, I'll say we found age to not be age is not a good predictor of the levels that we deploy. So that's interesting right there. Just that there's this difference.
Yeah, and let me just point out one factor there. It's important not to confuse worldviews with stages of psychological development. You can have people operating at a very high worldview, let me put it that way, or in spiral terms, one of the latest worldviews. But they still move through the stages of psychological development even with that worldview. And not confusing these two is vitally important.
Yeah, I think that's critical. I'll just give you an example, and then I'll just a little conclusion as it emerges. I've worked with a number of, and I'm sure, Zach, I'm sure you have as well. I'm sure this speaks for all of us, but I've worked with a number of people that come to mind right now who spoke world-centric very well, right? And they really articulated world-centric, and they believed in world-centric. But Richard, as you say, they were actually operating, if I could just use kind of a simple kind of 4-level, structure stage of consciousness, split, they actually operated at an egocentric level of consciousness. So they spoke world-centric. They were often heading organizations with world-centric goals, but actually they ran them from an ego or at best ethnocentric perspective. And the result was shocking. Right? So for example, one example where this kind of plays out is NGOs. The entire world of non-government organizations, which espouse, which talk, a kind of quite high level of consciousness, often, Richard, I would say at your level 6 and 7, right? Nonetheless, they're actually operating, at level 3, sometimes 4, using your system, Richard, right? Which means that NGOs, for example, can't work together, right? They find it completely impossible to work together because even though they share the same 6 or 7, they're really operating at 3 or 4, which actually creates a disaster in the field. And I'm sure you've come across this.
No, we've measured that many times in NGOs. They have these high personal values, high desired cultural values, but when you ask people which of these values represent how your organization operates, they're amazingly honest and they pick those lower level values. And so they're unable to live the higher level of consciousness because they don't know how to bond and cooperate.
Right. And as you said to me, that's exactly right. They're missing that kind of nucleus inside, that kind of carbon atom on the sapient level, Zach, as you said, right? And Richard, totally. And as you said to me earlier, Richard, I think it was about a year and a half ago, in some sense, a dimension of the unique self metrics already exists in your work. Let me just say a couple of words about it, right? That is to say, let's talk about unique self in 2 ways. Right? One is the unique self of an individual, and 2 is the unique self of a corporation. And John Marc and I just did a conversation with Forbes where we kind of developed the idea of the unique self of a corporation. And I'm sure it's an idea that, intuitively, Zach, you've kind of surfaced, and Richard, I'm sure you've surfaced it, many times. And the basic idea is, when we kind of coined this, the unique self of an organization, is that an organization has a self not only from a kind of corporate veil perspective. We often use the notion of a self of a corporation from a legal construct in order to protect it from kind of attack. But actually it has an actual cultural self, which actually has an interior, which is one of the things that you're measuring in cultural entropy, et cetera. So when you begin to think of the unique self of a corporation and the unique self of an individual, one could actually view, right, the tools, right, the cultural transformation tools that you've put into effect, Richard, actually as, proto-unique self, tools to start with that are actually already there, number 1. And here's number 2. It's a big number 2, and I want to kind of see if I can say this really succinctly and clearly. One of the things you and I have talked about, Richard, right, and Zach and I have kind of had this, I've shared with Zach a lot of our conversations as he's become a kind of driving force here, right, is to actually explicate the unique self language, right, in your new work. And you're working now, and you and I are kind of chatting about it together, but it's your project, which is kind of the work that you're working on now, is to actually explicate in your model clearly unique self, and it's my complete belief that will change the model. That, in other words, by actually, mutually fructifying each other, actually having a genuine collaboration. But if we actually put in unique self language, right, and unique self construct into the model, not just kind of obliquely but clearly, it actually activates, right, the unique self of the organization, the unique self of the individual in a much clearer way. And that's what I've found as I've talked to developmental researchers, where kind of, we would talk unique self. I remember talking to Don Beck, and he said to me after reading the Unique Self book, he finally understood yellow, that first level of second-tier consciousness in Don's spiral system. He said he finally understood yellow for the first time. He was like, wow, now I really get yellow in a whole different way. He said unique self is the Bible of yellow, right? In other words, so I think bringing together unique self and development, something that Zach and I are completely committed to, right, and that you and I have talked about, seems to will actually yield something which is, if I can use that old term from systems theory, a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. So that instead of trying to, kind of borrow your work for unique self metrics or, interpolate a couple of unique self words in your work, we actually come together and create something that's more robust, right, that takes, unique self into account at all the developmental levels, that takes states and stages, growing up and waking up, into account, that gets the huge treasure trove of wisdom, both kind of intellectually, right, and in terms of your enacting of this kind of in so many places. If we bring this all together, right, I think the future is exciting, and you need a unique self metrics very simply because actually living a person's unique self is the single most powerful motivating factor that we're aware of. Right? When a person actually tries to actually, right, articulate their life purpose and goals, it all emerges from identity, a.k.a. Charles Taylor's sources of self, right, but also a.k.a. simple common sense that my grandmother told me, right? In other words, I actually I'm motivated by, right, my sense of identity, right? And if I actually have an experience and a realization that I'm an irreducibly unique expression of the love intelligence that is the initiating and animating eros of all that is, that lives in me, as me, and through me, that I have a unique gift to give as a corporation or as an individual that no one else can give, and that actually all of reality in some sense profoundly needs that gift, right? The motivational value, right, and the kind of, meaning value is so enormous, right, that it can actually transform an organization, transform a culture, and Dave Logan's kind of pointed to this in his level 4 and 5 in his tribal leadership model, right, but without the unique self piece. So that's kind of, the utility of it is actually the same utility as the cultural transformational tools. It talks not just of the unique self of the organization, of the individual, but of the unique self of the organization. All the work that you've already done, there's no need to redo because you've done it so brilliantly. Can we now merge this? And I'm putting this as a question mark. Can we now integrate this, right, with unique self, with all of, Zach is, one of the kind of great, world experts in development, in the kind of Kohlberg and then Kurt Fischer lineage. If we can bring us all together here in this new kind of era of, collaborative emergence, it seems to me that, the sky is the limit in terms of kind of offering a real gift, right, into the emergence of culture.
Well, Mark, what a beautiful speech that was. And the answer to the question is yes, of course. And in fact, I have begun the book that you are talking about, and we've already beginning to talk about collaborating on it. The working title I have at the moment is A Psychology of Human Well-Being. You'll be pleased to note that even just today, I was introducing the false self, the unique self, and the true self into the introduction of that book. And so I hope that brings a big smile to your face, because I'm totally open to this collaboration, and it is, as you know, we have discussed this for some time. I'm progressing with this book right now, simply to get many of my thoughts down on paper, which are the thoughts of my unique self, and I hope to integrate Zach's thoughts of his unique self with your thoughts of your unique self, and hopefully we'll finish up with something that is so unique that it will be recognized by everyone as who they are too.
Amen. Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. What a pleasure. What a great speech, Richard. And may we give each other great heart openings. I mean, I am, just delighted. I mean, that's actually my interior feeling. And the Roland's interior is delighted with this conversation. I also can't understand how it went so fast. Deep bow to you, Zach. Right, Zach Stein. Deep bow to you, Richard. Thank you very, very much. And we look forward, everyone, right, to, being able to update with you with progress, as this unfolds. Thank you, everybody.
And one more thing, Mr. Marc,
Please.
I would like to offer publicly a huge thank you to you and Laurie from Krista and I for traveling all the way from California to Florence to conduct our marriage ceremony. Thank you. It was magical. It remains magical more than a month later. What wonderful memories. Thank you so much.
Deep bow to you. Thank you so much, Richard. I was completely honored. And I just have to say, we have to finish on a funny note. This is my funniest note at that time. I was wearing a white jacket and black pants, but I forgot to have black shoes. So I was wearing brown shoes. So a woman comes over to me, one of your guests, who I shall not mention their name, but a lovely person says, "Why are you wearing brown shoes? Could I take a picture of those brown shoes? They don't match with the pants at all." it was hilarious.
And you told her it was an expression of your unique self, right?
I tried to find my way out of it, but the truth is she had me cornered. She was right. Big blessings, everybody. Thank you very, very much.
Yes.
Shalom.
Thank you both.
Thank you.